The shape in the whites. The blizzard had been merciless for 3 days. Vaeltharin, once called the Stormwing of the northern reaches, could no longer feel his left wing. The iron chains wound around his body were old, dwarvish make, etched with runes that drank magic like a drought-starved earth drinks rain. They had been meant for one dragon. The hunters who had laid the trap had not expected two. He tried to remember sometimes in the long grinding hours how it had happened. The memory kept coming back in fragments, the way bad memories often do, not in clean sequence but in flashes, each one jagged. The valley had looked safe. That was the first mistake. 4 centuries of living had taught him that safety is a story the eyes tell the mind when the mind most wants to believe it. And he had believed it. Because Sarathas had been tired, and the valley had been sheltered, and the storm had been 3 hours behind them at most. The pit had been covered with a lattice of pine boughs weighted with snow. Clever, old-fashioned but clever. He had landed before he saw it, and by the time the lattice cracked beneath his weight, the runes on the chains buried just beneath the surface had already begun to sing that low, nauseating frequency that lived below sound and above feeling, the specific vibration that told a magical creature its magic was no longer its own. He had tried to lift. The chains had come with him, erupting from the packed earth like something alive, rapping fast and purposeful, and then Sarathas had landed beside him. Because that was what she did, what she had always done. She came when he was in trouble without asking whether coming was wise. And the secondary set of chains, the ones he hadn't seen because he'd been focused on his own, had taken her too. The hunters had come out of the tree line, 12 of them, well-equipped, well-organized, wearing the kind of cold-eyed professional calm that speaks to practice. They had looked at their catch with the satisfaction of engineers whose structure has held. Then the leader had looked at Sarathas's bolt wound, the one she had taken from a perimeter guard when she dropped into the valley, and said something to the others that Vaeltharin had not been able to hear. Whatever it was, it had made 2 of them uncomfortable. The leader had not seemed to share the discomfort. The leader had seemed to be doing arithmetic. An injured dragon that might not survive the transport was worth less than a dead dragon that was certainly here. That had seemed to be the conclusion, because the leader had given an order, and the group had packed their equipment and left, and the logic of it was as cold and clean as the valley itself. Come back in a few days, collect what the blizzard and the wound and the chains had left behind, and transport that instead. It was efficient. Vaeltharin could respect efficiency even when it was pointed at him. What he could not reconcile in the long hours since was the stillness. He was not built for stillness. 4 centuries of sky had made him constitutionally opposed to it. His nature ran toward motion, toward altitude, toward the particular freedom of elevation where the world simplified into wind and cloud and the faint, curved suggestion of the horizon. The chains had taken that. The runes had taken everything that might let him make his own wind. And what remained was this. A ridge, a collapsed hollow, the weight of iron and Sarathas's breathing, which had been getting worse since the second day. He had stopped trying to break the chains 4 hours ago. Not from despair, though despair had visited and made itself comfortable, pulling up a chair and settling in with the presumptuous ease of a guest who has not been invited but doubts very much they'll be asked to leave. He had stopped because every pull of the links tightened the runework and squeezed the breath from Sarathas, and he had decided some time before that point that he would rather die with his stillness than live with having crushed the last air from her lungs. The mathematics of that decision were not complicated. They were simply the kind of mathematics that take a long time to finish calculating because the numbers involved are not quantities but the specific weight of what certain things mean. Sarathas had come into the valley without hesitation because he was in trouble. He would hold still in the chains without struggle because she needed air. That was the whole equation. The variables were not interchangeable. They had not spoken in over an hour. There was not much left to say that hadn't already been said in the particular language of proximity, flank pressed to flank. His body angled slightly to break the wind where it came harshest from the northwest. The small adjustments he made when her breathing hitched, the way she would turn her head sometimes and rest it briefly against his neck and then straighten again, because she was, above all things, too proud to lean for long. The wind shrieked across the ridge above them, driving curtains of white so dense the world beyond 10 feet ceased to exist. It was a killing wind, the kind that found the gaps in things, in armor, in fur, in resolve. It had long since found all the gaps in Vaeltharin. He was cold in places he had not known could be cold. His fire, suppressed by the rune chains to barely an ember, gave him just enough heat to keep the core of him alive and nothing more. The extremities were stories he was no longer being told. Which was why neither dragon noticed the shape until it was closer than 10 feet. It moved wrong for the storm. Everything in a blizzard moved with asterisk the wind, snow, debris, the skeletal branches of frozen pines bowing and scraping in whatever direction the gale demanded, obedient to physics the way everything sensible eventually becomes obedient to physics. This shape moved asterisk against asterisk it, upright, two-legged, leaning forward at the waist with the specific geometry of something that has decided its own momentum matters more than the wind's opinion. Small. Vaeltharin's golden eyes, the only part of him still fully warm, eyes were important to dragons. Eyes were fed heat before almost anything else, because sight was survival fixed on the shape and narrowed. Humans. The recognition arrived without particular drama. He had seen enough humans in 4 centuries to recognize the silhouette even through horizontal snow at 10 feet. The rounded top, the 2 arm shapes, the upright carriage that always struck him as structurally ambitious for a creature with no tail for balance. This one was wrapped in heavy furs, dark and frost-rimed, head bowed against the wind, one arm raised at the elbow with the forearm parallel to the ground. The classic storm posture blocking the direct assault of snow from the face. It carried something on its back. A pack large and clearly heavy, listing to one side as the gale shoved at it with the bullying persistence of wind that has not yet encountered something it cannot move. It walked with the particular determined stupidity that Vaeltharin had observed in humans many times over his 4 centuries of observation. He did not mean stupidity as an insult, or rather, he had stopped meaning it as an insult sometime around his 3rd century, when he had begun to understand that what he was observing was not a failure of intelligence, but a specific and remarkable variety of will. It was the walk of a creature that has decided where it is going and has not yet informed its body that this might be impossible. The body would object eventually. The body always objected eventually. The human, in Vaeltharin's long experience, would hear the objection, file it somewhere, and continue walking. He found this baffling. He found it baffling in the particular way that things you cannot do yourself and cannot quite understand become, over enough time, something approaching reverence. The human stumbled on a buried rock. The pack swung hard to the right and nearly pulled it sideways. Its free arm pinwheeled out for balance, found none, and for one moment it looked entirely likely to go down into the snow and perhaps stay there. Then some deep, non-negotiable instinct brought a boot forward at exactly the right moment, caught the fall mid-fall, and turned it into a lurch that became a stagger that became improbably standing. The human caught itself, straightened, and looked up. For a long, strange moment, the blizzard seemed to hold its breath. Perhaps it didn't, perhaps the wind continued at the same shrieking register and Vaeltharin's perception simply narrowed in the way perception narrows when something unexpected occurs. But the memory later would always carry that quality of suspension. The snow pausing, the wind stepping back, the world going briefly and artificially quiet around the fact of this meeting. The humans stared at 2 enormous dragons chained together in a snowdrift. The dragons stared back at the human. Vaeltharin watched the face beneath the frost-stiffened furs with the focused attention he brought to all things worth understanding. He was too far to read features clearly, but he could read posture, and posture told him most of what he needed. The human had gone very still in the way things go still when the mind is receiving information that it has no existing category for. Not fear still, or not only fear still, the particular rigid paralysis of pure surprise, which is distinct from terror in that terror knows what it's looking at and wishes it didn't, while surprise has not yet finished identifying the situation. The human was identifying the situation. Sarathas exhaled a thin ribbon of smoke that the wind immediately stole, whipping it sideways into nothing. It was involuntary, a reflex of pain, the wound shifting with her breathing, but it served in that moment as a useful proof of life. She turned her head a fraction toward the human and then let it fall back, conserving the energy that small movement had cost her. "If it runs," she murmured, the words so low and rough they were barely sound, more vibration in the chest than voice, "I will not blame it." The human did not run. It stood there for 2 more seconds, 3, 4, and Vaeltharin could almost track the process happening behind those unseen eyes. The rapid, necessarily incomplete inventory of the situation, the threat assessment conducted by a creature that has nowhere near enough information but must make a decision anyway, the fundamental human question that he had observed so many times and still could not entirely predict the answer to, which was, do I move toward the frightening thing or away from it? The human took 1 step forward. Then another. Then it cupped its hands around its mouth, the gesture of someone who has been shouting into wind before and knows the technique, which suggested experience with bad weather, which filed itself away in Vaeltharin's ongoing assessment and shouted something. The blizzard received the words and destroyed them completely, rendering them into pure sound with all the meaning stripped out, but the asterisk tone survived. Tone is more resilient than content, more fundamental than language. It travels farther and arrives less damaged. The tone was the tone of a question, not a challenge, not a command, not the high bright spike of panic. A question, asked in the register of someone who genuinely wants to know the answer, which meant the question was genuine, which meant it was asking if they were all right. Vaeltharin stared. In 400 years he had accumulated a considerable catalog of human responses to encountering a dragon. Fear was the most common in its various subspecies, The screaming kind, the frozen kind, the kind that expressed itself as sudden and urgent religious devotion. Aggression was second, particularly in younger males of the species, who seemed to operate on an instinct that said large and unfamiliar and translated it immediately to asterisk challenge. He had been worshipped by three separate cultures at varying points, which was uncomfortable in ways that were difficult to articulate. He had been hunted by specialists, bargained with by merchants who thought themselves cleverer than they were, and occasionally serenaded by a particularly ambitious bard who had calculated correctly that a dragon is less likely to eat something it finds entertaining. He had been catalogued, he had been mythologized. He had been the subject of more prayers than he could count and at least 4 separate prophecies, none of which had come true in the specific way promised, though one had come uncomfortably close in spirit if not in detail. He had never, in all that accumulated time, been asked by a lone human in a blizzard if he was all right. Question sat in him strangely, not because it was foolish, though there was an argument to be made, but because it was asterisk simple in a way that wrong-footed him. It stripped away the mythology and the fear response and the complex social calculus and arrived at something so basic it almost didn't seem real. You appear to be in distress. Are you in distress? As though the size of the thing in distress was not relevant. As though the danger of approaching it was something to be noted and then set aside. As though the only thing that actually mattered was whether the answer was yes. The ember of his suppressed fire did something complicated in his chest. No, he said, though he knew the human could not possibly hear him at full voice over the storm, let alone at the careful modulated low register he was using, the one calibrated to not alarm, to not rattle windows in nearby buildings, to travel the distance between two creatures in conversation rather than between a creature and everything within half a mile. No, small thing, we are not all right. The words went nowhere. They did not need to. He said them because they were true and because truth in his experience has a value independent of whether it is received. The human came closer anyway. It moved with care now, not the previous forward lean of someone fighting across open ground, but the measured, considered movement of someone who is approaching something unknown and wishes to communicate through the approach itself that they mean no harm. Slower, more deliberate. Hands where they could be seen, Vaeltharin noticed, the large pack had been shifted, and the arms were no longer held close to the body but slightly out, the palms angled forward in the oldest possible gesture of openness. So old it predated the species that was currently making it. I am not holding a weapon, I am not preparing to attack, I am just a thing that is coming toward you. Vaeltharin had seen this gesture from humans before, usually when they were very frightened and very determined simultaneously, which was a combination he had come to associate with the subset of humans who ended up doing remarkable things, usually because they were too committed to their own decency to let fear make the final decision. Sarathis had gone very still beside him, and he could feel, through the chains and the pressure of contact between them, that she was watching. Her breathing had not worsened in the last few minutes. Whether that was coincidence or whether having something to focus on was doing what focus sometimes does, buying the body a little time, giving the mind something to hold onto besides pain, he couldn't say. The human stopped at 6 feet, close enough now that Vaeltharin could see a face beneath the furs, young or young adjacent, with the look of someone who has spent considerable time outdoors and has the weathering to show for it. Dark eyes, wide not with terror but with the kind of concentrated attention that processes fast and files everything. Snow on the eyelashes. A mouth set in a line that was not grim so much as focused. The look altogether of a person who has encountered an unexpected problem and is already, behind those attentive eyes, beginning to work on it. The human looked at Vaeltharin, then at the chains, then at Sarathis, then at the bolt wound, and something in the face shifted, not revulsion, not the flinching that some humans couldn't suppress around injury, but a tightening around the eyes that spoke of assessment and the specific discomfort of a person who knows enough about wounds to understand what they're looking at. The human looked back at Vaeltharin and said something else into the wind, another question, shorter this time, the shape of it on the lips suggesting 2 or 3 words at most. The wind ate it as efficiently as the first, but the tone again was readable, and the tone said, "What do you need?" 400 years. Vaeltharin looked at the small, frost-covered, entirely impractical creature that had walked toward 2 chained dragons in a killing blizzard and was now standing at 6 feet asking what they needed, and felt something move through him that he did not immediately have a name for. He turned the feeling over. It was not hope exactly. Hope was something he had set down a day ago with deliberate care, the way you set down something fragile when you are no longer sure you can hold it safely. It was something adjacent to hope, something that existed just before hope, the state that has to come first. The recognition that the situation has changed, that the variables are no longer what they were, that the calculation that seemed complete a moment ago may need to be reopened. It was the feeling of a door that might, against all probability, be ajar. Sarathas made the smallest sound, not a word. Just a sound low and worn thin by 2 days of pain and suppressed fire and chains, but unmistakably a sound of attention, of awareness, of a creature that has registered the same change in the situation and is waiting, with the patience of something that has been in pain long enough to have made peace with waiting, to see what happens next. What happened next was that the human reached up with both hands and pushed back the hood of its outermost fur layer. Because apparently it had decided that communicating through a wall of storm-stiffened fur was no longer acceptable, and that being able to be seen clearly was worth the cost of the cold on its exposed face. It was a small gesture, entirely practical, and yet. Vaeltharin had been asking himself in the long hours what a rescue would even look like. He had not come up with an answer that seemed plausible. He had not truthfully been asking the question because he believed in the answer. He had been asking it the way the mind, even a very old and experienced mind, keeps turning towards something it cannot have, not because it expects to find it but because it cannot stop looking. The human stood in the snow with its hood pushed back and its dark eyes clear and waiting, and the blizzard howled around it and through it and past it, and it did not move. "Come closer," Vaeltharin said, at full register now, letting the voice carry what the wind would allow. It would be fragments, it would be incomplete. But the tone would travel the same way the human's tone had traveled, stripped of some content, carrying the essential thing. The essential thing was, yes, come closer. We are not all right and you have asked and we will let you try. The human heard enough of it. He could tell because it moved not quickly, not with any drama, but with the same measured and deliberate steadiness with which it had covered the last 6 feet. As though steadiness was simply its natural mode, as though it had made some decision about how to move through the world and was not going to revise it just because the world had gotten strange. It stopped at 2 feet and looked up at him from that distance. The kind of distance where the scale of a dragon becomes inescapable, where the physical reality of 4 centuries and 40 feet of wing, and the particular ancient weight of a creature that is mostly made of accumulated time presses down on a human in a way that cannot be intellectualized away. The human looked up at all of that and did not step back. And Vaeltharin, against the specific logic of the past 3 days, against the arithmetic of chains and cold, and a bolt wound that had been working quietly toward its conclusion, felt the ember in his chest do that complicated thing again. The door was ajar. Something was going to happen next. To be continued in Part 2, What Warm Hands Can Do. What Warm Hands Can Do. Her name she eventually communicated through a combination of shouting, gesturing, and at one point drawing letters in the snow with her boot was Marin. The name came third after the more pressing communications. The first thing she had communicated, through the universal and ancient language of a person dropping to their knees beside an injured creature and opening a pack, was "I am going to try to help." The second thing, conveyed through the careful and deliberate way she moved around Sarathas's injured side rather than away from it, was "I am not afraid of the wound." The name came after those, almost as an afterthought, in the brief window between assessing the bolt and beginning to work on it when she had apparently decided that introductions were appropriate and had conducted them in the only way available. Shouting a single syllable into the wind, pointing at herself, repeating it twice, and then writing it in large letters in the packed snow at Vaeltharin's eye level with the heel of her boot. Amagarians. He read it and filed it, and the filing of it did something small but distinct, gave the shape in the snow a fixed point and anchor. She was not the human anymore. She was Marin. The difference was not nothing. She was not a soldier. He had established this in the first 30 seconds of watching her move. Soldiers have a particular way of carrying themselves in dangerous situations, a trained management of the body's alarm response that comes out as a specific kind of controlled stillness, present, ready, oriented toward threat. Marin moved differently. She moved like someone for whom danger was a complication rather than a context, something to be worked around rather than prepared for. She had assessed the situation and apparently concluded that the situation was 2 large injured creatures in chains, one critically in a blizzard, and I have a pack full of supplies. The danger had been noted. It had been filed in the same place as the wind and the cold, real, relevant, and not currently the most important thing. Not a mage either, which he had confirmed when she came within the suppression radius of the chains and nothing happened. A mage would have felt it, the way the runework pushed back against ambient magical sensitivity, a low unpleasant pressure that those who worked with magic described variously as a headache, a ringing in the teeth, or the sensation of a room that has been closed too long. Marin had walked into the radius and her expression had not changed at all. Whatever she was, she carried no magic that the chains could taste. The pack on her back, which she had shrugged off and set in the snow with the practiced efficiency of someone who has been taking that pack on and off in difficult conditions for a long time, contained the tools of a traveling herbalist. This revealed itself in stages as she opened it. The wrapped bundles of dried plants first, dark and aromatic even through the cold, tied with cord in the methodical way of someone who labels everything and returns it to the same place every time. Then the small clay pots sealed with wax, a dozen of them nested in a padded inner pocket, each one slightly different in size and seal color, a system Veiltharin suspected carried meaning he wasn't positioned to read. Rolls of linen bandage, a water skin which she immediately shook to check how frozen it was and then tucked inside her outer furs against her body to thaw. A flint kit in a waxed leather pouch. Various tools whose purposes he could partially guess and partially couldn't. And then, from the very bottom of the pack, wrapped in oilcloth and weighing what seemed like considerably more than its apparent size, a truly remarkable quantity of salted meat. She had looked at it and then looked at Sarathas, at the way Sarathas's ribs were working too hard with each breath, at the particular drawn quality around the eyes that 2 days without food puts on a creature, and had immediately begun pulling pieces free and offering them, one at a time, close enough to Sarathas's jaw that taking them required minimal movement. She talked while she did it, not to Veiltharin, not to herself. To Sarathas directly, the steady, unhurried patter of a person who understands that sound is its own form of medicine, who knows that a voice at the right register and the right pace does something to pain that cannot be entirely explained, but also cannot be entirely denied. She talked about what she was doing and what she was about to do and what the salted meat was made of elk, she said, from a valley 3 days south she had smoked and salted it herself. She hoped it was acceptable. She was sorry she didn't have anything better. She was going to look at the wound now. If that was all right, she was just going to look first. Sarathas, who had not eaten in 2 days, and who had been before this barely lifting her head, ate from Marin's hand with the slow deliberateness of a creature rationing energy and finding, perhaps, that the rationing was slightly less necessary than it had been 10 minutes ago. Veiltharin watched this small human kneel in the snow beside a dying dragon and work without hesitation, and felt something shift in his chest that he did not have an immediate name for. He was old enough to know that unnamed feelings are not lesser feelings. The ones that arrive without labels are often the ones that matter most, because they are encountering something the existing vocabulary was not built to describe. He let it sit unnamed and watched. Marin had assessed the bolt wound with the focused squint of a professional, the look of a person whose eyes are doing very fast, very specific work, cataloging depth and angle and the condition of the surrounding tissue with the efficiency of someone who has looked at many wounds and developed, out of necessity, a taxonomy of them. Her expression during this assessment was not pleasant, but it was controlled. She was not performing calm for Sarathas's benefit, or not only for Sarathas's benefit. The calm was functional. It was the face she apparently wore when the situation required that the part of her brain that felt things step briefly aside for the part that could be useful. She said several words. He couldn't hear them over the wind, but the shape of them on her lips and the brief hard closing of her eyes that followed suggested they were the kind of words one says when one has assessed a situation and found it worse than hoped but not yet beyond the reach of action. She produced a clay pot, one of the medium ones with a dark red wax seal which she broke with her thumbnail and peeled away carefully. The smell reached Veiltharin even through the cold and the wind, sharp, green, underneath it something older and earthier, the smell of things that grow in wet places and have been doing something useful for a very long time. She found a piece of linen, tore it to size with her teeth and one hand while the other held the pot, and began applying the contents to the edges of the wound with small, precise strokes. She explained while she worked, to Sarathas directly, not over Sarathas's head to Veiltharin, not to the air in general, but to the dragon she was treating, in the matter-of-fact tone of a healer who believes, on principle, that the patient is owed an explanation of what is happening to their own body. It would reduce corruption in the flesh. The wound had been open long enough in cold, wet conditions that corruption was already beginning. She didn't say this with alarm but with the flat informational delivery of a fact that has to be named before it can be addressed. The salve would slow it, she said. It wouldn't reverse what had already started on its own, but it would buy time, and time was what they needed right now. It would sting, she said. She was sorry for that. It had clearly stung considerably. The sound Sarathas made was low and came from deep in the chest, the grinding boulder's register of a creature in pain that is working very hard to manage the expression of that pain and only partially succeeding. She turned her head away and bit down on a mouthful of snow, the old instinct of something that needs to clench its jaw and has found a target for the clenching that won't cause additional damage. Her whole body had gone briefly rigid, the chains going taut in a way that made Veiltharin hold very still and breathe very shallowly. Marin had kept working. She had not flinched back, had not paused in a way that suggested she was waiting to see if the large, dangerous creature she was touching was going to make a decision about her. She had simply continued same pace, same precision, one hand steadying the linen, the other applying gentle, even pressure at the wound's margin, talking in that same low, steady stream that said, "I know this hurts. I know this hurts, I am not stopping because stopping won't help you. It took Vaeltharin a moment to understand what he was looking at. He had seen courage before. 4 centuries provides a comprehensive education in courage, and he had developed a reasonably detailed taxonomy of it. There was the courage that comes from not understanding danger, that was common and not particularly impressive, being more a product of ignorance than of will. There was the courage that comes from having something large enough to fight for that the fear becomes secondary. That was the most common kind among humans, and he respected it, though it had its limits. There was the courage that is trained into a person through enough repetition that the fear response is blunted, which was what soldiers generally had and which was more reliable than most but which also had a ceiling. What Marin had appeared to be something different. It was the courage that comes from having decided at some fundamental level that the work matters more than the discomfort of doing it. Not an absence of awareness of the discomfort, not a suppression of it. A genuine, considered prioritization, the discomfort is real and the work is more important, and that ordering has been settled so deeply that it no longer requires active decision-making in each new moment. It just runs. It runs while the hands keep moving, and the voice keeps talking, and the large, dangerous creature 12 inches away makes sounds like grinding stone. Marin finished with the wound margin and sat back on her heels, and looked up at Sarathas with direct, dark eyes. The bolt needs to come out, she said, loudly enough to cut through the wind, not loudly enough to be harsh, but there was no cushioning in the delivery either. She was not trying to soften the information, she was trying to give it clearly. I can't do that alone, I don't have the leverage. A brief pause, the kind that acknowledges the weight of what comes next, but if it stays in, the wound closes around it and everything gets much worse. Another pause, do you understand me? She understands you, Vaeltharin said. He had spoken at full conversational register, which was, he recognized immediately from the result, considerably more volume than Marin had been prepared for at close range. She startled badly. The whole body went briefly rigid in the way of creatures whose threat response has been activated before the conscious mind has caught up, and she spun toward him with her hands coming up and her eyes very wide. She stared at him. He watched the process run across her face in real time. The initial spike of alarm, the rapid identification of the source, the reclassification of asterisk sudden large sound to the other dragon is talking asterisk, the recalibration of her entire understanding of what she was working with here. It took approximately 4 seconds. At the end of it, she looked like someone who has just had a significant assumption dismantled and is doing the structural work of building the new framework quickly. Right, she said, her voice was entirely steady. Right, of course, she lowered her hands. Can she speak or? She is conserving her strength, Vaeltharin said, more carefully this time lower, slower. She understands every word. He paused and did what he had been doing for decades without ever having been asked to explain or translate it. He read Sarathas. The faint movement of her eyes, the angle of her head, the specific quality of her stillness which was different from the stillness of unconsciousness or the stillness of exhaustion in ways he could not have articulated but could read as clearly as script. The old language. The one they had built between themselves not from intention but from the accumulated sediment of long proximity, from years of being two creatures in the same spaces, making the same observations, reaching the same conclusions by different routes and learning to track each other's route from the outside. What Sarathas's eyes said was not complicated. It was the oldest thing she ever said to him, the thing underneath all the other things, the bedrock statement that everything else rested on, I trust your judgment. Do what seems right. She says to do what you must, Vaeltharin said. Marin nodded. It was a nod of the kind that accepts information without ceremony and immediately moves to the next thing, which he was beginning to understand was her characteristic mode. She had been given permission, she would proceed. But she had looked at the chains first. Not a glance, a real look, the same assessing quality she had brought to the bolt wound, the same rapid cataloging eye moving from link to link, tracing the runework where it was visible, following the chains from where they bit into the base of Vaeltharin's neck down along his body and around and beneath and back up through the complex knotted arrangement that bound them both. Her brow had furrowed. He watched her read the chains the way a person with some relevant knowledge reads something they weren't expecting to encounter with recognition. And with the particular focus of someone mentally pulling up information they stored long ago and checking it against what's in front of them. These are suppression chains, she said. It was not a question. The tone was the tone of confirmation, of a label being applied to something that has already been identified. Oh yes. She crouched lower, bringing her face closer to one section of chain where the runework was densest, and traced a few of the marks with one gloved finger without touching the metal itself. Her lips moved slightly. Reading, he realized, reading the runes the way you read script in a language you know but don't speak fluently, working it out with the conscious mind rather than the automatic one. Dwarvish third-period runework, she said, still in that tone of someone verifying a conclusion. If I'm reading the style correctly. She tilted her head slightly to the right, which he had already begun to understand was her tell for active processing. The binding logic in third period work runs in a sequence. Each rune in the chain feeds the next one. If you disrupt them in the right order, the whole sequence unravels. If you disrupt them in the wrong order, they tighten, the Veilthorin said. Yes, she looked up at him. My grandmother dealt in old metalwork, salvage, mostly clearing old sites, identifying pieces, occasionally breaking them down safely when they were dangerous. A brief pause that was not quite a beat and not quite a hesitation, the pause of someone who has arrived at the relevant conclusion and is deciding how to frame it. I might be able to do it, break the binding sequence. There was a silence that lasted approximately 3 seconds, which was the time it took Veilthorin to run the obvious question and find he couldn't not ask it. You have done this before. He did not try to keep the disbelief from his voice. He was 400 years old, and he had learned that performed credulity serves no one, and that Marin, specifically, already struck him as someone who would prefer honest skepticism to polite pretense. She looked up at him. The expression on her face was, remarkably, almost amused. Not laughing, there was nothing laughable about the situation, but the specific expression of a person who has expected the skepticism, finds it reasonable, and is not going to pretend otherwise just to seem more reassuring. No, she said, flat, direct, no ornamentation, but I've read about it, a beat, and I'm the only one here. She let that sit for exactly as long as it needed to sit, which was long enough for the logic of it to arrive fully. The complete, unadorned logic that said, the alternative is nothing, and nothing is what you had before I walked out of the blizzard, so the question isn't whether my qualifications are ideal, the question is whether you want me to try. She looked back at the chains. Do you want me to try or not? Veilthorin looked at Sarathis. He did not look at her for the translation this time. He looked at her because she was the one the chains were killing, and she was the one who was owed the primary voice in this. And because in 400 years he had never made a decision that was primarily hers to make without first making sure she had been consulted, and he was not going to start now. Sarathis looked back at him. Her eyes were fully open, the most alert she had been since the second day. Whatever reserve she had been hoarding, whatever small, careful store of energy she had been keeping banked against necessity, she had drawn on enough of it to be present for this. He read her the way he always read her, that long-practiced translation of glance and angle and the specific quality of a stillness that could say many different things depending on its texture. What her eyes said was this: the human is here and the human is willing, and we are not going to refuse that on the grounds that the universe should have sent someone better. The universe sent what it sent. We accept it. And underneath that quieter, the thing she would never have said aloud even with full voice available. I would like to see the sky again. The snow fell around them all, patient and entirely indifferent to the outcome of the calculation happening inside these two old creatures. Fell the way it had been falling for 3 days, without agenda, without the knowledge that it was falling on anything in particular, just the simple ancient arithmetic of cold air and ice crystal and gravity doing their long, uncomplicated work. Try, Veilthorin said. Marin did not say, "Are you sure?" and did not say, "All right then," and did not perform any other verbal acknowledgement of the decision beyond a single short nod that was already mostly directed back at the chains rather than at him. She had been given the answer. She was moving to the work. She pulled off her outer fur gloves, tucked them under her knees so the wind couldn't take them, pressing her weight down on them with the automatic practicality of someone who has lost things to wind before and learned the lesson permanently. Her bare hands emerged, reddened already from the cold that had been finding its way through the fur, the knuckles slightly raw, the fingers moving through a quick flex and spread that was either habit or preparation or both. She moved to the first rune. And Veilthorin, who had spent 400 years acquiring the understanding that hope is something you hold carefully if you hold it at all, felt the unnamed thing in his chest shift again. Felt it moving, slowly and with great care, in the direction of something that might, if handled gently, eventually be willing to accept a name. The wind screamed across the ridge above them. Marin's bare hands, steady and certain, began their work. To be continued in Part 3, What Humans Carry *. What humans carry. It took her the better part of 2 hours. The blizzard did not ease for any of it. The wind came in long sustained walls and short vicious gusts with no predictable interval between them, and the temperature, which had already been somewhere well below the range that kills unprotected humans efficiently, continued its patient downward work. Veilthorin tracked it in the way he tracked most things, not obsessively, but consistently, with the background attention of a creature for whom situational awareness had been survival for 4 centuries. He watched the frost accumulate on Marin's outermost fur layer. He watched the way her breath came and went in plumes that the wind snatched immediately. He watched her hands. He watched her hands most of all. Veilthorin did not speak during most of it. He watched. He had found over the course of his long life that watching humans closely was one of the more instructive things a dragon could do if one had the patience for it. Most of his kind did not have that patience or chose not to exercise it, which amounted to the same thing. Most of his kind looked at humans and saw appetite and noise and brief, flickering lives, candle flames to a dragon's slow bonfire. The metaphor was not inaccurate exactly. The lifespan differential was real. The noise was real. But the metaphor stopped where metaphors usually stop, which is at the point where the thing being described becomes complex enough that the simplification starts costing more than it reveals. He had always thought this was a poverty of imagination. A candle flame is brief, this is true. A candle flame is also, if you look at it correctly, a thing performing a minor continuous miracle, consuming itself in a process of extraordinary chemical complexity to produce light and heat from almost nothing, doing it against entropy, doing it for as long as it possibly can. Brevity is not the most important thing about a candle flame. It is merely the most obvious thing which is not the same. Marin worked through the chains methodically. That was the first thing, the methodical quality, which he had not taken for granted. Methodical is not the same as slow. She moved with the economy of someone who has learned, through whatever combination of instruction and hard experience had built her, that efficiency and thoroughness are not in opposition, that the fastest path through complex, careful work is almost never the one that skips steps. Her bare fingers traced each rune first, not touching the metal at the rune's center, which she had identified early on as the activation point, but running along the carved lines at the margins, reading the sequence the way you read script, left to right and top to bottom, and then the connecting lines that linked one rune to the next in the chain of logic that was the binding. She had the iron stylus out within the first 10 minutes. Small thing no longer than her hand, worn smooth at the grip in a way that said long use. She had produced it from inside her coat, from a pocket sewn into the lining at chest height, which suggested it lived there habitually, which meant it was something she used regularly, which revised his estimate of how often she encountered situations requiring the disruption of carved metalwork. He filed this without comment. She pressed the stylus to specific points in the carved lines with a pressure that was consistent but not aggressive, not trying to scratch or deface, but to interrupt. The runework in third-period dwarvish binding chains ran on the principle of continuous flow, magic moving through the carved channels like water through an irrigation ditch, each rune both consuming the flow and feeding the next. Break the channel in the right place and the flow downstream starves. Break it in the wrong place and the pressure that has nowhere to go finds the nearest available release, which was the tightening mechanism. The engineering was elegant, in the way that things designed by people who are very serious about containing dangerous things tend to be elegant, redundancies built on redundancies, failsafes under failsafes. The whole system designed with the assumption that whatever was trapped inside it would be trying constantly to get out. Marin had not been trained by dwarves, he was fairly certain of this. What she had was the structural understanding that comes from someone who has looked at many things and developed a feel for how things are built, not the specific knowledge of the maker but the general literacy of the dedicated student of made objects. It was slower than the specialist's knowledge would have been. It was also, he thought, possibly more careful because she was not relying on habit. She was reading each rune as she came to it. She was making each decision individually. She muttered to herself constantly. He caught fragments when the wind shifted, not full sentences, not coherent speech, but the running commentary of a mind working out loud, the kind of murmur that is not meant for any audience but serves as a check on the internal process, as though hearing the reasoning in one's own voice makes the reasoning more legible. This one feeds that one, so this first, then back. No, the connector runs the other direction. Start here. She made mistakes. This was the part he watched most carefully because mistakes in this work had specific consequences and he needed to know how she responded to them. The first mistake came at the 20-minute mark. She pressed the stylus to a point that disrupted the wrong rune in the sequence, and he felt it immediately, the chains shifting, a subtle increase in pressure, not the full tightening of a triggered failsafe but the preliminary tension of one being approached. Sarathas made a sharp sound. Marin pulled the stylus back instantly, assessed what had happened with 3 seconds of focused looking, and backed up 2 runes in the sequence to the last stable point. She said one short word, a single syllable that the wind ate before he could determine its content, but that the shape of her mouth suggested was not polite. Then she continued. She did not catastrophize. She did not spend time on the mistake beyond the time required to understand it. She did not ask him if Sarathas was all right in a way that would have pulled her attention from the work that would make Sarathas all right. She backed up and continued, and the continuation was as steady as the work before the mistake had been, which told him something important about the architecture of her composure. It was not a surface condition. It was not maintained by things going well. It ran the same regardless of whether things were going well or not, because it was not a response to circumstances. It was simply how she was built. When her fingers went white with cold, she would stop, not step back, not break the working posture, but pause in place and press both hands flat against her own neck. just below the jaw where the large vessels ran closest to the surface, where the warmth of the body's core was most accessible. She would hiss at the sensation, the contrast between the near-dead cold of her fingers and the living warmth of her neck, and hold the position for 30 seconds 40, until the color began returning to the fingertips. Then she would bring her hands back to the chains and continue. She did this 7 times over the 2 hours, he counted. She did not complain. He considered this carefully because complaint is sometimes maligned as weakness when it is actually just information, and he was not interested in the simplistic version of what he was observing. She was not silent because she was suppressing something. She was silent because there was, for her, apparently nothing to say. The cold was a condition of the work. The work was what mattered. The cold would continue regardless of whether it was named aloud or not. She was not ignoring it. He could see it in the periodic warming pauses, in the way her whole body was managing the sustained exposure with the specific efficiency of someone who knows exactly how cold they are and is tracking the threshold carefully. She knew. She was simply not spending any energy on the knowing beyond what was required to keep working safely. She did not ask for acknowledgement. She did not pause at any point in the 2 hours to look up at him with an expression that sought confirmation that she was doing the right thing, or that appreciated the difficulty, or that wanted any return at all on what she was spending here. The work appeared to be, for her, entirely self-contained. She had assessed what was needed and committed to it, and the commitment was not conditional on anything he did or didn't do. He had met very few people, human or otherwise, of whom that was true. The first chain fell away from Vaeltharin's neck at the 90-minute mark. He felt it as a physical thing and as something else simultaneously, the iron weight gone, yes, and with it the specific pressure of the runework against his skin, but also the lifting of the suppression, the return of something he had not realized he had been experiencing as a deprivation until it stopped. His own nature. The electricity that lived in his blood, the specific charge of a storm dragon's body, the feeling of being fully himself rather than a reduced version of himself. He drew a full breath for the first time in days, really drew it, from the full capacity of his chest, not the careful, shallow management of breath that the chains had required, and the air that came out was different from the air that had been coming out for 3 days. Sharper, the faint smell of ozone. A faint crackling, barely audible, like the moment before lightning when the air changes its mind about what it is. Don't. Marin said it without looking up. Sharp and immediate, the tone of someone who had anticipated this exact moment and had her response ready before it arrived. He stopped, held the impulse he hadn't known he'd been forming until it was named and checked. Not yet, the binding sequence on the lower chains is still active. She was already moving to the next link, the stylus following a connector rune he hadn't seen her identify. If you release before I've disrupted it, they'll tighten as a failsafe. The upper chain release is designed to feel like freedom and isn't. The whole system assumes you'll surge the moment the first restraint goes. The silence that followed this was the silence of Vaeltharin updating his understanding of several things simultaneously. You knew that, he said. She glanced up for exactly 1 second, the fastest possible acknowledgement, the look of someone allowing themselves one beat of human response before returning to the work. I suspected that, she said. There's a difference. A pause while she repositioned. Stay still. He stayed still. He thought in those last 20 minutes about the distinction she'd drawn. I suspected, not I knew. She had worked for 90 minutes on the premise of a suspicion, had built her entire approach around a consequence she had not been certain of, had factored it into every decision, had been ready with the warning the instant it became relevant. All on the basis of a suspicion derived from reading and from logic, and from the structural understanding of how things built by cautious engineers tend to work. She had not told him about the suspicion beforehand, and he found examining this that he was not troubled by it. She had not told him because telling him would have required time and explanation and might have produced exactly the response she needed him not to have, and because the information was only actionable at the moment it had been delivered. She had carried the suspicion and managed it and deployed it at the precise instant it was needed. 4 centuries, and he was still occasionally surprised by the things small creatures carried quietly and spent at exactly the right moment. The last chain fell 20 minutes later. It fell differently from the first, not with any particular drama but with a finality that the first had lacked, because the first had only been partial and this was complete. It dropped into the snow with a sound that was almost gentle, a soft metallic settling, and the silence after it was a different kind of silence than any that had preceded it. Sarath is moved. It began as a tremor, the deep muscular shudder of a body that has been still for too long, releasing the stillness all at once. The shudder running from the base of her neck down her spine and out to the tip of her tail. Then the uncoiling, long, gradual, the first free movement she had made in days, each segment of her body reclaiming its range with the careful deliberateness of something that knows it has been injured and is taking inventory as it goes. She stretched her wounded side, extended it, assessed the pull and the ache of it with a moment of focused attention, and found, apparently, that the assessment was not worse than she had expected. Not good, but survivable, but something that could be worked with. The sound that came out of her was not a roar and not a cry. It was something rower than either, a long, low exhalation that carried in it 2 days of pain and suppression, and the specific relief of a creature that has been reduced to a partial version of itself, and has been returned, however imperfectly, to something more complete. It moved through the cold air and dissipated and left a silence that felt different from all the silences before it. She turned her head toward Marin. Vaeltharin watched Marin receive this, watched her look up from where she was still kneeling and find Sarathas's eyes at close range, those dark, enormous eyes that were at this moment doing something that he did not think required translation. An expression that even a human, he thought, could probably read without assistance. Something between you did this, and I see you, and the particular gratitude that is too large for any specific gesture, and so simply rests in the eyes and stays there. Marin was on her knees in the snow. Her bare hands were tucked under her arms, the instinctive self-protective posture of someone whose hands have gone past uncomfortable and are now sending the specific signals that say attend to this. She was shaking. Not the small shiver of someone mildly cold, but the deep involuntary shaking of a body that has been managing an exposure for 2 hours through will and focus, and now that the focus has released, the body has immediately sent everything it has been holding back to the front of the queue. She had been ignoring the cold for the better part of an hour. The cold had been patient, the cold had waited. Vaeltharin moved. He moved carefully, deliberately, with full attention to the communication of his movement, because there is a particular responsibility that comes with being very large near something that has just spent 2 hours helping you and is now vulnerable. He brought one wing down and around in a long, slow arc, not closing it, not creating any shape that could be read as enclosure or trap, but angling it to intersect the worst of the wind, placing the broad membrane between Marin and the northwest, building a wall of scale and bone and leathery wingskin that the blizzard hit and broke around. The wind in the hollow dropped by perhaps half. In absolute terms, it was still cold. In relative terms, it was the difference between exposed and sheltered was what mattered. Then he lowered his head, brought it down until it rested in the snow approximately 2 feet from where she knelt, close enough to be present, far enough to be a choice she could make rather than a thing that was happening to her. He breathed out. Slowly, controlled, managing the release the way he managed most things that required delicacy. Not suppressing the fire but not opening it either. Finding the middle register where the warmth could radiate without the flame. The furnace heat of a storm dragon's inner fire moving outward in a sustained, gentle wave. The air between them changed. From killing cold to something that was, if not warm, at least no longer actively removing heat from the world. Marin looked at him. He watched her read the situation, the wing, the angled head, the heat, and arrive at the understanding of what was being offered. Then she leaned forward into the warmth without a word. No thank you, no acknowledgement of the gesture as gesture. She simply moved toward the thing that was helping her with the same unceremonious practicality with which she moved toward everything and pressed her hands toward the heat and shook. He let her shake. He did not say anything for a time that was long enough for some of the shaking to ease, for her hands to regain enough color that the vessels were clearly open and the blood was moving. Why? Vaeltharin asked. He did not explain the question. He did not gesture toward the chains or toward Sarathas or toward any of the specific elements of the preceding 2 hours. The question was complete as asked, and he believed she would know that because she was someone who understood that some questions contain everything they need to contain without elaboration. She was quiet for a moment. The shaking had moved from violent to steady, still present, but the kind that speaks of a body doing its normal thermal management rather than a body in distress. She was looking at Sarathas, who had brought her own head down and settled it nearby, close enough that her slow-out breath, warmer than a human's, carrying the faint mineral smell of a dragon's inner heat, moved the frost-stiffened fur of Marin's hood with each exhale. Close enough to be warm. Close enough to be, in whatever way a dragon can be, present. You were hurt, Marin said, and you were there. The simplicity of it arrived in him like something dropped from a height, not shattering, but landing with a weight that was felt throughout. He turned it over. Examined it from several angles, the way he examined things that seemed simple and might not be, and found that it was actually, upon examination, precisely as simple as it appeared, and that the simplicity was not shallowness but the opposite. The kind of simplicity that is what remains after everything complicated has been stripped away, the irreducible thing at the center. No calculation, no measurement of risk against reward, no legend to seek, no story to carry home, no debt being paid or obligation being met. She had not helped them because of what they were or what they might give her or what would happen to her if she didn't. She had helped them because they were hurt and they were there, and she was someone for whom those two facts in combination were sufficient. He had seen humans move mountains with less. He had also in 400 years seen humans do extraordinary things for complicated reasons, for glory, for survival, for love, for the particular stubbornness of a creature that has decided it will not be the one who walked past. Those things were real and he did not discount them. But this was different. This was the version that existed before the reasons, the version that was not a calculation but a fact of character, the version that said, the situation is what it is and I am who I am, and those two things together produce a specific result, and that result is that I stop and I help. It was, he thought, the most human answer she could have given. It was also, he thought, one of the finest answers he had encountered in 4 centuries of collecting answers to difficult questions. He did not say this. Some things are better kept as internal facts. You will need to travel somewhere safe before the next storm, he said instead. I know, she said it without heaviness, not resignation, just acknowledgement. She had presumably known this before she had walked out of the blizzard toward them. She had been traveling somewhere when she found them. The somewhere still existed. The need still existed. She had simply spent 2 hours doing something else first. We know these mountains. He let a pause follow this, not a dramatic pause, not a pause of uncertainty, but the pause of someone who has arrived at an offer and is choosing to let the offer breathe before it is delivered. A consideration offered honestly with full awareness of what it was. We could carry you. Marin looked up at him. He had not known entirely what he expected to see. Some version of the rapid processing he had watched her do all afternoon, perhaps the recalibration, the fast internal inventory of what was being offered and what it meant and what the correct response was. What he saw instead was simpler than that. She looked at him and something that had perhaps been quietly tense in her, some small background vigilance she had been carrying since she walked out of the blizzard and had not set down, settled. Whatever she found in his old gold eyes, the eyes that had seen 4 centuries of sky and mountain and the long, slow passage of the world through time, satisfied something in her that had been waiting to be satisfied. She nodded once, the decisive, unhurried nod of a person who has never needed ceremony or deliberation for the things she is certain of. Sarathas made a sound then, a quiet thing low in the chest, the kind of sound that lives on the border between rumble and word, between physical sensation and communication. She was looking at Marin with those dark, deep eyes that had been on her in various registers of intensity since Marin had first knelt in the snow beside her and begun to work. Veiltharin translated without being asked. He had been doing this for decades and he would not stop now. She says, hold tight. He paused because Sarathas was still going, the sound continuing past the first statement into something more. She flies fast, even wounded, and the sky does not forgive hesitation. It was true, it was also, he recognized, something more than a practical instruction. It was an offering of the specific kind that Sarathas rarely made, an invitation, a disclosure, a small and deliberate act of sharing the thing she loved most about herself, which was the flying, which was the speed, which was the particular quality of being so far above everything that the world becomes a thing you can hold the whole of in your vision at once. She was saying, you're going to see what I am when I am at my best, even diminished. I want you to be ready for it. For the first time since she had stumbled out of the blizzard, Marin smiled. It was a small thing, tired around the edges, wind-chapped, belonging to a face that had spent 2 hours in a killing blizzard performing extremely precise manual work with bare hands. But it was there, genuine and complete, the smile of someone who has received something unexpected and finds, against the weight of the day, that they are glad. Good, she said. Her eyes had gone bright with something that was not quite humor and not quite relief but partook of both. Neither do I. He believed her. They rose as the blizzard was doing what blizzards do, howling, pressing, making the particular argument that weather makes when it has decided that nothing living should be here. Marin had her pack on her back and both hands in Sarathas's neck scales, fisted into the gaps between the plates the way a born writer holds, which she was not, but which she figured out in approximately 4 seconds by the logic of what would hold and what wouldn't. Sarathas lifted with the slow initial power of something that has been chained for 3 days, and is remembering what its body can do, and then, when the ground fell away and the ridge dropped and the blizzard spread out below them and the sky opened above, with the gathering, accelerating, joyful speed of something that has been given back the thing it is made for. The storm broke as they rose above the ridgeline. Or perhaps it didn't, perhaps the blizzard continued below them exactly as it had been continuing, full of its own agenda, indifferent to what moved through it. Perhaps what broke was simply the relationship between them and the storm, the moment when altitude made the wind irrelevant and the cloud layer became a floor rather than a ceiling, and above it was the sky in all its cold and extraordinary clarity, black, blue, and enormous, and full of the hard, brilliant light of high-altitude stars. Veiltharin thought, rising on his own wings beside Saratha's, watching Marin's small figure against the vast dark scale of Saratha's back. Her face turned upward toward the stars with an expression he could see even from here. He thought that perhaps the storm had simply had the good sense to step aside. Some things, even storms, know when they are not the most important thing happening. Zandal.